Hello, Brother Monroe here. Welcome back to Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts with a very special guest and our resident historian, Drachinifel.
Hello.
And we are here today to talk about the results from the Battleship League Division 4. So hopefully those results will be coming up on screen in a moment. But we've had a chat about what happened, and you've seen all the battles pretty much. What do you what do you think of how the ships did?
It was interesting. I was pleasantly surprised to see that my main predictions that Strasbourg was going to win and Congo was going to do horrifically badly both came true. And Scharnhorst
Poor
being
old
a kind of
Congo.
middle of the pack, was also something I had foreseen coming. So that was all quite good. Renown and Doria were kind of switched places compared to where I thought, which was also interesting because I mean it is a little bit different that's a bit different to what I thought. But as we were discussing a little bit beforehand, it's not when we stop and think about it, it's actually not necessarily so surprising because Doria was at its core a battleship,
Yeah,
albeit an old one, whereas
yeah,
everything else is mostly at their core battle cruisers, even if they've had refits or in Strasbourg's case, kind of a redesign mid-construction. Scharnhorst is kind of is a weird one, as we said in the build video, where it's armored like a battleship, but with the guns that you might more expect of a battle cruiser.
yeah,
But it's I'm not too shocked by the results, but it is also it's fun to see that there's a couple of turn-ups for the books compared to how I thought things might actually go.
yeah. It was really interesting to see Doria actually doing quite well, and really surprised me because I thought that the 12 inches would not do particularly well.
Hmm.
But they proved surprisingly effective at kind of dealing with the enemies up close. Now I know that a few people in the comments are like, "Why aren't you staying at range?" And I certainly could have, stayed extensively at range. But what would have happened would be that you'd end up not getting any results at all. It would be a
Yeah.
load of draws everywhere. So that's why we kind of closed in. But the winner here, Strasbourg, you may be wondering why we're rebuilding it if you're watching this. Where's the ship gone? Well, there was a major update to Ultimate Admiral Dreadnought, so we have to rebuild her from scratch because all of the saves got deleted,
Yeah.
which is a little bit annoying. But we only have to rebuild this one ship because she's going on to Division 3, where she will be facing a few other ships, which are a little bit more powerful, shall we say?
Just a bit.
Just a little bit more powerful. Yeah, she needs a rebuild, but we also have some other things to talk about in terms of how she is. I'm just kind of watching the video back, and I think that was the main gun and towers as they were. Now, of course, she did have to finish one of her battles, Strasbourg, by ramming, which possibly isn't historical. I know ramming went in and out of favour at various points in naval history, but I don't think it was particularly in vogue in World War Two.
Not if you could avoid it, but then at the same time, if that's your last ditch resort, then you might as well. And from what I recall of that particular fight, there was both sides were not really going home.
No,
Let's say
no,
afterwards.
Um,
So
not
yeah,
easily anyway.
someone just turning around and going, you know what? if we're not going home, we're going to make extra sure that they're not either.
Mm.
It's not the most unbelievable thing on the planet.
No, I think was it Glowworm who tried to ram a German ship at one point. I mean,
Yeah,
it makes a little bit more sense in that case, but yeah, it would be considered unusual, but it made sense to me at the time. I'm a little bit of a hot-headed captain, I suppose.
It's unusual, but it was not unheard of, I think, is the main thing.
So, here we have... I should put the funnel back on. Here we have pretty much what we had before, and there are some newer options over here, which I'll fill in as we go. I'll just put in all of the new things, but there have been a couple of kind of changes to the game, and one of the main changes has been to shells. So we have now a choice of our ratio of AP to HE shells for the main guns and the secondary guns, and we can also choose the type of high explosive and the type of armor penetrating round that is used. And I am very much completely at your mercy in terms of what on earth we do with those options, because whilst I have actually seen your video on naval artillery, I don't know what the French Navy in World War II was deciding to use. So any advice on that is greatly appreciated.
Yeah, it's it is one of those rather wonderful things where there's an awful lot of fine detail to go through, but simultaneously, it's I suppose it's going to be kind of like the propellant and the rudder choices that we've made. Yeah. It'll be kind of explaining why these things actually matter, and then kind of going, yeah, and everyone's pretty much doing the same thing.
Yeah, because once we choose this once, I mean, it's going to be a kind of standard choice for most of the navies, isn't it?
Yeah, for the most part. I mean, there's a few unusual ones. Ironically enough, the Dunkirk and Strasbourg is in fact one of the slightly unusual ones.
Ah, excellent.
But compared to everybody else, but that should still be fine.
Okay, so I'm assuming that we'll stick with the cordite propellant, and the picric acid shell bursting charge, which is nice. They've renamed it to bursting charge, which makes it a little bit more clear what you're picking. But so what about ratio of shells? What was the kind of go-to naval doctrine for your main guns? Were they carrying a lot of high explosive rounds for their main guns?
So typically, no. I mean, it varies. It varies quite a bit. So, but over the course of the sort of the big gun period, because beginning of the 20th century and the late 19th century, there is actually quite a high proportion of high explosive.
Yeah.
Because they're thinking about just blasting apart the enemy rather than anything else. Whereas, as time goes on into World War One, you start to see more and more armor piercing, and you also have something which I'm actually quite pleased that they're modelling in the game, which is CPC as a shell head.
Find that. It'll be these ones, soft capped, common pointed capped shells.
Yep, common pointed capped, and then the next variant as well. Common pointed capped ballistic. Yeah. Now that's if we ever come back and do this for World War One ships, which might be interesting at some point.
Yeah, that would be.
That's
cool.
going to feature quite interestingly it was basically only the British that really went for it. Mm-hmm. But they are quite the fascinating shell because they're almost the bursting charge of an HE shell.
Yeah.
With, as the name suggests, they actually do have an armor-piercing cap of a sort. And they typically, depending on the size of the shell and the range, they typically have somewhere between 50 and 70% of the penetration capability of an AP shell.
Yeah.
Now
that's
yeah,
gonna hurt.
Yeah, the British ended up getting rid of them for the most part because the kind of lightly armored targets that they thought they were going to use them against kind of went away as the Dreadnought race developed. Although, oddly enough, they were still, given that most World War One ships, with the exception of the Americans, were still using the distributed armor scheme. The CPC shells, in retrospect, probably would have actually been a better thing to use. On the on-paper stats suggest that you should use armor-piercing shells because that's the only thing that you've got that will penetrate the thickest portions of the German belt armor. But retrospectively, we know that the British fuses weren't really up to all that much, and the actual full-on belt penetrations therefore were relatively rare. The shells had much better opportunities when they're penetrating thinner bits of armor, which they hit. And at that point, if you're not going to get many main belt penetrations, and the majority of your hits are going to be on either unarmored or lightly armored portions of the ship, you're probably better off with the massively greater CPC shell charge.
Yeah.
Because that'll do a tremendous amount more damage. Yeah, it's just one of those wonderful ancillaries, but obviously that's a rather specific shell type, which when I saw the patch notes, I was like, oh, they've actually put that in. Well done. Somebody actually bothered to do some research.
It's really interesting as well, if you're playing through the campaign. So most of the technologies, you think that, you get this one first and then it comes through like this. That's not how it works at all. I think you get nose and base fuse to start off with, and then you get access to the high capacity. So they kind of unlock, as they did historically, as far as I can remember.
Yeah.
But as you go through the campaign, initially you don't have all the options.
No.
And it's not a case that cap ballistics are best and the incendiaries are worst. It really is a choice, and I really like that.
And then just for the viewers who may be a bit confused, the difference between nose and base fused, the clue's in the name as to where the fuse itself is, but the reason that makes a big difference is that the nose fused ones, as soon as they hit something when they're HE shells, the fuse will start to initiate. Because it has to, because it's milliseconds away from becoming junk and trash as it smashes through a bunch of metal. But what that means is that the shell detonates near enough instantly upon impact, which is fine if you're hitting basically superstructure, unarmored superstructure. But if you're hitting anything else, you're just going to end up with a detonation external to the ship, which might do something, but that you'd be much better off with a base fuse, because the base fuse, with the shell with the fuse at the back, the detonation is the fuse initiation. Is taking place just a fraction later, when the shock of impact catches up with the back of the shell, and it might only be milliseconds, but it can make all the difference when you're talking about something that's traveling at supersonic velocities. And also because it doesn't have to detonate instantly, because the base is going to be mostly intact in most cases, it means you can put a slight delay on it. Not quite the same delay that you'd put on an armor piercing shell, but it allows an HE shell, if it does hit something like, half-inch or 1-inch plate, which might be typical shrapnel proof plating or something, it means that the shell will be partially or possibly even fully into the ship before it explodes, which is obviously going to do a lot more damage.
Yeah, and obviously this is quite a new update for me, and in game terms, I have noticed that is the behaviour you get. If you go for kind of these ones, you get very few or no ricochets, but you also really don't see penetrating hits. It's mostly partial penetrations, or sometimes even just blocked, lots of fires, and sometimes you can overwhelm the damage control. But if you go for these, particularly if you combine the improved capped common pointed ballistic capped, that's a mouthful, shell with something like the tube powder propellant and go for a really, really high velocity HE shell, you can do some pretty horrible things with 16-inch high explosive shells and things like that, because they will go through kind of your armor very easily and then go right inside the ship and cause a lot of damage. So yeah, this is really interesting that this is here. So what was the most common shell type in World War II, and what was Strasbourg running around with?
So for ships that are expecting to fight other ships at the capital ship scale, they're far more commonly they've got far more AP aboard.
Yeah.
It varies depending on obviously the smaller ships, but a battleship typically will be carrying a majority AP rounds, unless it's an American battleship that's going in for a shore bombardment mission, in which case it flips around. It's like you can get up to 80% HE at that point. But we're assuming that they've loaded. Yeah, we're assuming they're loaded out for an AP setting.
Yeah.
The funny thing is, specifically with Dunkirk, is that in the records, although it's supposed to have an armor piercing and a high explosive shell, almost all the inventories just talk about armor piercing shells.
Okay.
So it's possible that, well, we know that they did design HE shells for it, but it's possible they didn't ever actually send any, or possibly any meaningful number of them out into the wide world. So specifically with this, max AP for the main shells would be the appropriate thing.
And was that the same for the secondary guns, or would they perhaps be carrying high explosive?
The secondary guns would definitely have high explosives available to them. They absolutely had to, because otherwise you'd be in a lot of trouble.
So what would you? It's just the standard kind of ratio, with where they basically have half and half. Basically, standard is half and half, and then increased. I wish they had actually just show you the ratio. It says plus 25 and minus 25%, and it gets to plus minus 50, but that's 50% of 50. So I think at max you have 75% of one and 25 of the other. Standard is 50-50, and then increased is kind of in the middle, 66% basically.
So for the Dunkirk, you want about 1/3 for the secondaries, about 1/3 semi-armor piercing, 2/3 HE.
So that would be
roughly
increased HE, I reckon then.
Yeah.
Okay. And then what kind of HE shells would she have likely been carrying if she had? Obviously, the main gun ones we're not sure, but on her secondaries. Because they share the type they have.
Yeah. By this point, pretty much everybody's using base fuse. The Americans have high capacity HE. They're the ones who invented it in a lot of ways. But yeah, pretty much everyone else is using base fuse HE for when it comes to capital ship secondaries, and a lot of cruisers as well. Nose fuse, by the time of World War II, is actually fairly rare, again, unless you're doing something like shore bombardments.
Yeah. Okay, and what about the AP shell type? So we have semi-AP, semi-armor piercing shells, semi-armor piercing ballistic cap shells, armor piercing shells, armor piercing cap shells, armor piercing ballistic cap shells, and improved armor piercing ballistic cap shells. And then there we go. I've actually managed to say all those words.
Yeah. So with the Dunkirk, it is supposed to be an armor piercing capped shell, but there is a bit of debate over that, because they do have an armor piercing cap, but it's not the world's largest cap, and there's quite a bit of explosive in there as well, compared to your average gun. I mean, the bursting charge on the 13-inch shell is just a fraction under 45 pounds of high explosive, which, to give some context, that's kind of it's actually a greater explosive payload than many American battleship shells of the period, and it's on a par with the explosive payload of some of the British battleship guns, and the British are notable actually in World War II for having some of the largest bursting charges. So I think probably the second option,
semi-ballistics.
Yes, that probably most closely reflects the fact they've got they're chucking a fair amount of explosive downrange, but it's not quite got the same level of armor piercing capability as some of the more generic shells.
Okay. That's really interesting. And just so that we're kind of in the right ballpark, I think we went for light shells before. So with that, it gives the AP shell weight as 697 kilograms.
Okay.
Being fired at 889 meters per second.
Which, I mean, the muzzle velocity is actually not far off at all. The muzzle velocity on the historic guns was 817 meters per second, but it's quite a bit heavier. There's kind of 570 kilos for the historical French round. But then we've already gone with a light shell, so there's not a tremendous amount more we can do about that.
I'm actually wondering if you change that. Yes, although that doesn't help hugely.
No.
That makes them 734. That one makes them 624 if you went for
just semi-armor piercing.
Semi-armor piercing.
I suppose at that point, it's do we want to go for the behavior of the shell, which would be the semi-ballistic capped, or do we want to go for the weight, which, I mean, it's still not accurate, but the SAP would be more accurate for it. I think probably to go for the behavior. So go for the ballistic cap. Yeah, because otherwise we'd be reducing its penetration potential below what it actually historically would have been.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know how HE shells are lighter and faster for some reason.
Yes, yeah, that's generally the case. Well, because if you think about it, if you think about a shell, it's got to be the same overall dimensions roughly. Some shells are fractionally longer, but they've all got to fit into the barrel of the main gun.
Yep.
So there's not too much variant in the dimensions, but the density of steel is a lot more than the density of any explosive. So if you have an armor-piercing or semi-armor-piercing shell that's mostly steel, it's going to weigh an awful lot more than a high-explosive shell, which is majority explosive by volume.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, so if you're using roughly the same charge, the same propellant charge, it means that your HE shell is going to go... is A, going to be lighter, and B, it's going to come flying out quite a bit quicker.
Okay. Right. Well, I think that's pretty much her then.
Yeah, we don't need to make any beam adjustments because we don't have the quad 5s. So
no, we don't have the quad 5s. Although that is very nice that we can now. Sorry, I forgot that she had. I've got her bulkheads and her range mixed up. Yes, we can now adjust beam and draft if we like, which is a nice option.
Yeah.
Nice option to have. Down here, it does actually tell us length, beam, and draft. So I was actually curious how this compared to the historical values.
Right. So what have we got?
They're in feet and inches, which I don't know if it's.
That's fine.
Okay. So we've got her as a 688 foot 2 inch long, which is
just a fraction shorter than her real life length. Her real life 704 feet.
That's not too bad because the length isn't something that we have granular control over anyway.
No.
Beam of 97 foot 9 inch,
which is close 102 foot in real life.
Okay, and draft of 46 foot 5.
Now that unfortunately, I think that's because of the massive aft weight offset.
Well, I think as well because I had a user submitted challenge, which was you build a US battleship that fits through the Panama Canal, and draft was where I came up wrong. And I know it sounds crazy, but I think Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts might have a very unusual definition of draft because every ship I've looked at has a crazy high draft. I I don't know
Yeah,
what.
so her historic draft is about just under 30 foot.
Yeah.
So we're talking about it's like 17, 18 foot more. I'm wondering is maybe they're measuring draft from the main deck level.
Yes, that's what I think
it's
they're
not
doing as well.
it's actually a poorly expressed figure because draft should be from the waterline down.
Yeah.
But
so this bit.
if they were measuring it from say the quarterdeck aft or kind of around a turret,
Yeah.
I wouldn't be shocked to find that total length from keel to the top of the deck is 46 foot.
Yeah, and I definitely think it is that because when you I'm not going to because it'll mess the ship up. But if you start playing around with draft, what happens is the whole ship in the z-axis basically moves up and down, and it's not just the kind of below the waterline. You're not just shifting the waterline up and down. So I think they do. I think they're either measuring draft from here or here.
Yeah,
it's hard to tell.
One thing that I do find quite fascinating about this is we've created a very fractionally shorter, very fractionally slimmer version of the real life ship, which is in and of itself interesting. I mean, I think most of the length that we're missing is probably that long spine that we talked about in the previous build video, where historically the quad midline turret would have sat. But the power requirement is to within like a saloon car's engine's worth of power, almost exactly spot on.
This number here.
Yeah.
Yeah, 107,247 horsepower.
Yeah, and historically the ship needed 107,500.
Oh, there we go.
So, yeah.
It's really nice because I know the game is not designed to be a historical simulator in any way. It's fun, but it is really interesting.
It gets closer than most. You know, for a game, it gets closer than most for in terms of it rough accuracy.
Yeah. No, it's really, really interesting. Thank you very much for talking about this. I'm curious to see how Strasbourg does against the ships she's going to be facing, which are going to be a little bit meaner than this. But before we do that, there is something to mention. There are now 3 radars.
Yes.
So I think fair enough to leave her on the Gen 2 because the Gen 2 is a bit of a what if from us anyway.
Yeah, I think the Gen 3 is probably only really going to come in if we're as when we get to things like Vanguard, Iowa, and then in this division more applicably probably when we're looking at something like the Nelson. We're going to have to make some interesting decisions with that one.
Yeah, and that will in fact be the next build video that we will be doing. Which I am enormously looking forward to. But for today, thank you very much. Thank you for, really fascinating insight into kind of what the different shell types were in the ratios and things like that. We'll be back for the Nelson build.
Yes.
Okay. Bye bye for now.
See you.